Right. Hi, I'm Olivia Grasso. I'm the nonfiction editor for issue 31 of Superstition Review. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Oscar Mancinas for the SR blog. Oscar is a Raramuri Chicano poet, writer, and teacher based here in Arizona. His debut collection of short fiction titled To Live and Die in El Valle won a 2021 Border Regional Library Association Southwest Book Award. Welcome, Oscar. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is about your essay titled The Warrior Classic and the Aztec Duels. In this piece, you write that movement is essential to how we relate to our homelands. I was wondering if you could share a bit more about this idea and how it informs your writing.
Sure, yeah. So in that particular passage, I make reference to I use the terms both huhugam and anayawari, which are respectively Atam and Aramuri words that, to translate them into English, sort of mean those who've come before us. Ancestors is kind of, I think, the most literal translation, but my understanding of these terms is they're much more expansive. They don't simply refer to, human ancestors, but also beings and even non-living things that have predated us and really kind of inform the way we live, right? The way we come to know the world around us. And that the idea of movement is informed both by the fact that I have migrant parents who are from, the other side of the political boundary that separates the United States and Mexico. My father is Aramuri, so he is, his homeland is even more sort of, there's another sort of layer to the idea of movement there because he didn't grow up on our ancestral land. And nevertheless, the sort of, I'm interested in like how that it's not a deviation of norms, but kind of is its own way of living for so many, right? I mean, if you live in Arizona or really in the US in general, movement, migration, displacement, whatever term comes to mind ends up really informing complete ways that people live. Oh no, is my video stuck?
You're stuck.
Oh
Okay, now
no.
you're not. You just
Okay.
unfroze. Okay.
Yeah, oh gosh. This is happening. But yeah, and so that is sort of the broad, right, the big broad thing. And I've sort of connected that to different research topics I've looked at and history. But then also in this very like, interpersonal sense, exercise, movement, and just how integral that is to understanding the Southwest, and maybe even just, if we want to be specific, the Salt River Valley and the Sonoran Desert, that at different times of year, different times of day, moving around, you experience where we live pretty differently, and trying to like take stock of what that teaches us, or like connecting things like mental health to a practice that is as simple as like walking around, running around, and moving your body in the space.
That's really fascinating, and I like the idea of physical movement being a way to connect to the land around you, because I think a lot of the times we think in kind of emotional terms, like an emotional connection to your homeland, but bringing like physical movement and even exercise, as you mentioned, kind of adds a different layer. And that kind of brings me into my next question, along the lines of physical movement. This essay is sort of about your experience as a wrestler. And I was wondering what inspired you to choose that experience to write about, and did you face any challenges with writing from memory?
I was a high school wrestler, which the essay is seemingly kind of about. It's kind of going back to my final year, really the kind of final months I spent being a high school wrestler, because it's for anyone out there who's ever wrestled in high school or at a high level, it's it's an interesting experience, the sport. I have a lot of love for it. I still really sort of if I catch a random like NCAA college or high school wrestling thing on TV, I'll stop and watch, because once you've been on the inside, like you understand the sport, and it's not
Mm,
that there's a high bar of entry, but it's not the most publicized sport, right? Unless you know someone or were involved in it, you kind of just it just looks like people grappling to you, and it's hard. It can be tough to know like, well, who's winning or who's losing. So I'd known for a while that I wanted to write about that experience, because it had been so important to me when I was young, to the point where when I could no longer do it, it really dramatically altered kind of how I thought of myself, and also where I thought I was heading. Like I thought I was going to potentially go to college, not like major D1. I don't want to big myself up here in case anybody who was around high school wrestling in Arizona in the the late 2000s knows, but like I was getting mild offers, and I thought like, oh yeah, this is like the way when you're young, you're like, well, this is just a thing I do. This is part of who I am. It's,
mm,
I can't ever imagine my body failing me in this way, right? Or this being too overwhelming physically, because when you're young, you sort of, you bounce back from things, or you can tend to bounce back from physical things pretty quickly. And so yeah, I'd wanted to write about wrestling. This probably won't be the last time I really get into it. I've written it. I've mentioned wrestling in like short fiction pieces. I'm interested in kind of, obviously it's rich for metaphor when it comes to writing, sort of one versus one opponents. It's a sport that really is just, it is physically taxing as it is psychologically taxing. It's a very isolating sport. You're technically on a team, but you don't take the field of play, the mat in this case, with your team. Like it is you out there.
mhm,
And so in that ways it is a bit distinct from other team sports that I think people can do in high school. um and so plumbing back into it, like the sort of the memory element of it, to the second point of your question, it it is sort of curation, like, well, what's relevant here and why, what direction, right? Because I don't, part of me like wanted to write a, this was it, this is when I had to hang it up, and I still get an itch, I still think about it, as I sort of, the piece kind of alludes to. But I'm also now reaching an age where a lot of the physical consequences of kind of being in this sport so intensely are showing themselves. Like my left shoulder just hurts randomly at times. I've had to deal with other consequences from breaking that bone in my foot. It's thankfully not arthritic yet, like I sort of write in the piece, like, but it, that's coming, and I'm just kind of being mindful of like, this is kind of, I'm on the other end of where this journey kind of began with the piece, where it's like I knew that the debt would come for this, right? The bill would come due, and now I'm experiencing it. And looking back, or even looking back and projecting forward, how do I feel about it? Do I sort of not have regrets, but like, do I have any second guesses, or do I sort of yearn for things to be different? And on the one hand, yeah, it'd be cool not to like have parts of your body randomly hurt, but the sport was, like I said, it was really important to me at the time, and I remember really wanting to push myself to like get everything I could out of the sport, out of myself, at the time. And so yeah, that's sort of what, I mean, kind of where the piece formulated out of.
mm. And I imagine those things you mentioned, like your shoulder hurting or your foot, those are pretty vivid reminders of that whole experience in high school. So you were kind of already thinking through these things just in your daily life,
Yeah,
those
because that,
physical reminders.
yeah, they come that because you remember, oh yeah, that's when this happened, right?
Mhm.
And like, sure, that I mean, I've done other sports since, right? Or I've probably, like, you do other physical activity that like hasn't helped, right? Tweak, like a rolling an ankle here and there, if you're like playing pickup basketball, or kind of reaching for something funny. But yeah, the genesis of like the body I have now, is that's where it came from, was sort of in the midst of that, and specifically that final year, where I had to quit.
Hmm. I'm also interested in another point you brought up, which is that our physical fitness can be so like interrelated with our identity. Like for you, being a wrestler in high school was just a very significant part of who you were and still are to an extent. So with that in mind, like how central to your writing in general are these concepts of identity and belonging?
Probably almost inextricable from most of the things I've written thus far. I think I've thought about these things, and and they're part of other work I do, including my dissertation research as well. Again, because of biographical details about me, I have migrant family. I I was born on in a different country than a good chunk of my family, but I have family that sprawls across multiple borders, and so especially when the rhetoric of exclusion, of extraction, the all the rhetoric around closing things off and deportation, all that. I've swam in those waters since the moment I was born, so it's kind of difficult not to think of yourself kind of in relation constantly to those terms, because they are so, even if you don't want to think about them, like they are in your face, right? And so to try to not to try to resolve those things, but understand them, engage them, and maybe even invert them, right, is pretty central to how I write, because like on the one hand, belonging can be like what belonging feels like is so subjective, right? Like what is belonging like? What does that actually feel like? Are we conscious of it when we feel like we truly belong? I know there are a lot of wonderful pieces of writing that I think kind of really try to get at the heart of that like this is where I felt I truly belonged, or when I finally arrived, right? The sort of that this stops being a question. But I'm also like curious about like what if that is just a constant process, and we have to work actively at it, and we have to like remind ourselves to pursue it, in the same way, like I mentioned in the piece, the anecdote about movement and belonging, and the Raramuri youths who in the 1920s were taken from a group of them were taken from our homeland to Mexico City. And you might say like, well, this is the same nation, right? They belong here. What other nation would they belong to? But they didn't feel that way because for people who don't know the piece, the story goes that they ran home. That's how sort of out of sorts they felt. And again, you have movement, right? That this idea of movement, that belonging can be so localized that even within the national boundaries, it doesn't quite convey the same. And so negotiating those terms is somehow simultaneously so personal, but also like really collective. And at least that's what I try to kind of like, that is a balance I try to strike in my piece, because I'm not O'odham. So although I am indigenous, my indigeneity is not to the Salt River Valley. It's not to the Sonoran Desert. And it's not to the place I was born and raised, so I want to try to be mindful of that, and to sort of like, again, work toward like, what does it mean to belong in another's occupied land, right? In terms of how I think of myself, and also how I sort of write about the place that I do love. I love it. I love home. It is home. I call it home. But it's not as simple as like, well, I call this home, so it's home, and there's end of story, right? There's nothing left to say. I think there's a ton more to say.
Yeah, the idea you brought up of localized belonging is really fascinating to me, and kind of the challenges that come up with moving, physically, and kind of being forced to find a new sense of belonging. And so would you say that for you, you've been able to feel that sense of belonging in multiple places in a genuine way, or is there like one place in your mind where you feel the strongest sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's the former. I've been fortunate to, because I've moved around a little bit, throughout my life. Mostly once I got out of high school, I went to college on the other side of the country, and I also did graduate school out there. I've lived out of the country briefly. all the while, and this goes back to again the creating the belonging, I was fortunate along the way to find some great like communities, to find and create community. And like even if I didn't feel like I belonged, in a sort of permanent sense to a place, or I thought like, well, this is where I'm settling, or this is where I'm going to live, it did help to meet other people, pursue similar interests, to share things, right? I did a creative writing program, and like I would not have made it through had it not been for the fact that I made friends, I found colleagues, we shared writing, we shared our enthusiasm for things, the kinds of writing we thought were important, the kinds of books we really liked, kinds of books we didn't like, bonding over that. And as it pertains to belonging here where I'm home, part of that is my family's here, my family has been here for a few generations, and I'm familiar with it. But part of it has also been in reading and writing, like reading works by Arizona authors like Ofelia Cepeda, like Alberto Rios, kind of I sort of refer to them as like literary elders, like seeing how like, okay, like how have people tried to put this into words before? What does that look like? What and then what can I learn from them, for my own writing and for my own research?
Hmm. Yeah, there's definitely so much value that can be found in a community of writers, especially writers that kind of share a homeland or just a place as you do. There's a lot of understanding that can come from that, with seeing how they have experienced the same land or something that you have. So yeah, I really like that. Moving on to another question I have. You've written fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, and I'm wondering how your approach to each of those genres kind of differs in any other genre that you've experimented with.
Yeah, it kind of going back to the seeing what's been written before. I kind of is where a lot of this process starts. Is I'll read something, or I'll come across a piece of writing or a piece of art that is, I find kind of like I like, or just sticks with me, that I'm like, that's a really fascinating way to kind of engage this or to write about this. Like part of the structure of this piece is was inspired by Wayne Kostenbaum, who's also a poet and a nonfiction writer. And in this essay he wrote called My 1980s, which is similarly sort of written in this nonlinear, these vignette sort of structures. And that piece is specifically about him, his experiences as a young gay man in New York City throughout the 1980s. So the AIDS epidemic is at times in the background, at times in the foreground. But what I really sort of find striking about that piece is like, this is what the representation of this is what time would feel like in the midst of an epidemic, right? And so that's where the inspiration came from. For anyone who's been conscious for the last couple of years, time has not felt linear. It's been really hard to sort of track things. And so that was sort of kind of, I knew I wanted to write a piece eventually, right? Something sort of in that structure. I didn't really know what it would be, but I sort of, I come across structures like that, or I come across interestingly crafted, but to me, what I find interestingly crafted pieces, and I go, I wonder what I would write if this, if I were to sort of take on this form, or I wonder what I would say about this, and kind of gestate on that for however long. That piece, I first read that piece like nearly a decade ago, and I come back to it periodically because I not only did I sort of borrow the structure from it, but there's a lot of meta commentary and sort of like almost like fourth wall breaks where Kostenbaum also like comments on his own writing in a really funny way. The final part of that essay is like really funny, I think. It's pretty understated, but it's very funny. And so when it comes to, but this piece could have easily been a poem, or it could have easily also, I don't know, like that the structure could have been used in a piece of fiction. I think the only kind of consideration is I start with something like a line or an image, or again, an idea, a structure. And I think like what feels appropriate, or maybe what feels like a conscious inversion of this, and is there anything there? Do I want to keep working on it? and I'll share it with colleagues, with friends, get notes, get feedback, and depending on what I hear back, sometimes it's like maybe this doesn't totally work like this, and I have to put it away, or like there's something that I can extract and use in a different piece at some point. Like I just sort of kind of like a pack rat. I hold on to drafts of things, and the end result is sometimes they're an essay, sometimes they're a poem, sometimes they're a piece of fiction, sometimes they're kind of a hybrid. And I'd like to believe I have more of like a conscious, like a more deliberate thought going into a lot of this stuff, but it's not always the case.
Yeah, I think some of the best work just happens intuitively. But with structure in mind, I think that with this piece, the Warrior Classic and Aztec Duels, the nonlinear structure suits it really well because it's about memory and recall. And people don't really recall things in a linear way, in a streamlined way. So I like the vignettes in the very like fragmentary form. I think it works really well. And you also kind of have like a meta quality, I would say. Like there's a line where you draw attention to the fact that you're relying on memory. Let me find it. Oh, for something so indebted to memory, notice how disciplined I am about writing. I remember. I thought that was a great line. So
I
you're
didn't want to. Yeah, sorry. Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. You're like conscious of the fact that you're sort of recalling these things as you go and piecing them together. And I think that's a really clever structural thing.
Oh, thank you. I also just I didn't want to bore a potential reader with like I remember,
Right.
which can be I think melodic in some pieces, but I for this I was like I don't know I don't think it would work quite as well.
It's so funny you say that because I just had to read a piece for this creative nonfiction class, and I forget the author, but the whole form was every sentence begins with I remember, and it's like 160 or so pages, and it does get a little
Yeah.
tiring.
Well, I mean, you have to commit, right? Over 100, like that's the thing. I felt like if I was going, I'd either have to commit and write something, sort of really follow through the structure, like to like overdoing it, or I would have to, pull back because I think for the length of the piece, it just was sort of, I didn't want to get caught in like in the sort of in between.
Right, because I'm sure there were a lot more memories that you could have kind of brought into the piece.
Mhm.
Um, my next question is you're also a teacher. How has your experience as a teacher shaped your writing?
It is a great chance to be around writing, to be around people figuring out writing and figuring out their own relationship to their writing and to each other's writings. In the classes I've taught, I was trained. The way I was trained as a writing teacher was emphasis on peer reviews, on sort of collective and group work, and it's great for me because I'm not much of a lecturer, and also I sort of really believe in trying to decentralize a classroom a little bit and kind of go with where the students really want to go. So it being a writing teacher has been great because it again you get to sort of work alongside other writers, and in some cases who rely on you more, some cases who don't rely on you as much, right? They're young writers kind of go all over, they come from all over and they go all over, including writers who are like, I hate writing, I don't actually believe in it, and they end up writing some of those brilliant things, of course. And then it's a nice humbling reminder because, like as I just said, sometimes you or I should say I like will read a line, a sentence, an image, and I go, that is a really, really incredible passage from this younger writer. It makes me excited to encounter it, and it makes me more determined to like be constantly evaluating how I engage language, how I write, because yeah, it's sort of there's something to be said for experience and practice, but then there's also just the spontaneity and sometimes this as a writer, you sometimes you sit down at the computer or at the notebook and you just like you have like the idea comes to you or the line, whatever it is, like it comes to you nearly fully formed, and you're like, I I got it. I think I did like a month's worth of work in 5 minutes, and this is, it feels, I wish it were more, the relationship between time and effort and outcome were more linear. It's not. So I really relish the opportunity to teach writing, to learn from the writers I get to work with, learn what are some of their favorite writers. It helps me keep up with things like that, which I otherwise might not have as much exposure to.
Hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful that you can find inspiration in a classroom with young writers just starting out. Because I think there's a lot of value to like be able to see what a young person is doing right from the start, like with no prior experience. There's kind of something unique about that. And sort of their just perspective on things as just not a like very experienced writer, but they're sort of figuring out their own style and voice and everything. It's pretty fun to witness that. My final question for you is, can you tell us anything about what you're working on now, new projects?
Yeah, sure. So I am obliged to say I am working on my dissertation. I'm a doctorate candidate at ASU in transborder studies. So for my advisors or anybody else watching, I am working on the dissertation still. So hopefully I'm hoping to make great progress on that and be finished within a year, possibly longer, but there's that. I just published, hold this up, my first full-length collection of poetry called Papeles, Palabras, and Poems from the Desert. It's out through Tolson Books. It came out in December of 2022. So I've had a chance to read at the Tucson Festival of Books. At the end of this month, on March 31st, I will be reading at the Northern Arizona Festival of Books. Northern AZ Book Fest, that's what it's called. And yeah, so I'm hoping to have more opportunities to share that work with folks. I still work on fiction and nonfiction. I mean, I have a sort of stuff that I periodically will send out, including this piece, which Superstition Review was gracious enough to house on the blog along with this interview. So I think those are the big things for now.
That's wonderful. Yeah, congratulations on your poetry getting published and good luck with your dissertation.
Thank you. I'll need it.
Do not envy you on that part, but well, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down for this interview today. I really appreciate it. And it's been a joy to talk with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.